Okay, thanks very much, everybody, for coming. My name is Chris Bale. I'm a professor of sociology and public policy and data science at Duke University, where I direct the Duke Polarization Lab. And I want to thank David and Iyad and Manuel for putting this together. It's really just been a treat to be here and to be in such good company. So my talk today is going to be a little more applied, perhaps, than Iyad's talk. I'm going to talk about a recent study that just came out last week, where my colleagues and I used bots to study echo chambers and political polarization amongst a very large group of Twitter users. So many of you have probably seen one of these ubiquitous images. This is a Twitter network where the red nodes are Republicans, American Republicans, and the blue nodes are American Democrats. And despite the unique properties of the kind of bimodal US system, we see this time and again in different countries that people tend to cluster according to their political beliefs in social media networks. And so you probably already knew that before you came here today. But the tricky thing is, if we're trying to understand the effect of social media echo chambers on people's political views, is that we've got a kind of circular causation problem. So is it the case that what we see on social media is shaping our political views? Or is it the case that our political views determine how we stitch together our social media networks, who we choose to friend or follow? And if we can't disentangle those things, if we observe with observational data patterns where social media tracks political beliefs, we can't know that it's the social media or something else that is shaping people's political views. So what we'd like to do is kind of take people out of these so-called echo chambers, or patterns of information sharing where people are repeatedly exposed to the same type of information that reinforces their political views. So we'd like to do an experiment where we could ask, how does exposure to opposing views shape political polarization? So my group tried to tackle this using a combination of bots, survey research, network analysis, automated text analysis, and machine learning. But before I get into the methods, which I think will be of particular interest to the group, let me say a little bit about the theory, the social science theory motivating this research. So the first hypothesis we pre-registered 3 hypotheses. And our first hypothesis was in line with much public reasoning about social media and political polarization. That is, if we could disrupt people's social media echo chambers and expose them to opposing views, we would see more moderation. So as you may know, the elephant and the donkey are the symbols for the Republican and Democratic Party in the US. And so the idea here is that if people can see each other as individuals rather than members of rival political parties, they may be able to better empathize with each other, and that interpersonal contact may challenge stereotypes they may have each other that emerge in the absence of this kind of intergroup contact. Now, there's an important caveat here, which is the social psychology that this is based on interpersonal contact and stresses the kind of positive conditions necessary for this stereotype reduction. And also, especially influential, seems to be the role of cooperation. And so we could debate whether social media, and especially Twitter, allows that kind of intimate intergroup contact that might reduce political polarization, but alas, we thought it was one good idea. Our second hypothesis is what we call the backfire effect. And this is in line with a growing number of studies in sociology, political science, and social psychology that have shown that if you try to correct people's false beliefs, for example, many Americans, as you will know, believed that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And a number of studies showed that if you try to correct that misperception, people actually double down in their pre-existing beliefs. They tend to hold their pre-existing beliefs even more strongly. And the mechanism here is probably some type of motivated reasoning. When we encounter a message we don't like, It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. We begin to come up with all the different reasons we might not like that opposing view. And then we're left with even more reasons to disagree with the view than we might have had we not encountered the view in the first place. And so this is in line with, again, a number of recent studies, including a book I wrote several years ago on the rise of extremism in the US. Our third hypothesis that we pre-registered was that this pattern would be asymmetric. So we predicted we would be more likely to see backfire effects among conservatives in the United States than Democrats. And the reasoning here is based upon a few different social science theories. The first comes out of cultural sociology and social psychology. And this is that the values or the basis of Republican and Democratic identities in the US emphasize different types of things that would make Democrats more favorable towards opposing views and Democrats less favorable towards opposing views. And those are specifically an emphasis on tradition and conformity that several studies in political psychology have shown have been predictive of Republican Party choice. And conversely, those who embrace diversity, diversity is seen as a strong liberal value, right? And so it could be this personal level difference. It could also be that Americans are taking cues from their political leaders. So this graph shows voting behavior among elected officials in the US over the last 50 years or so. And this DW nominate score on the x-axis describes whether or not legislators or elected officials are taking conservative or liberal positions, and what the data show pretty clearly is a marked shift to the right beginning in the 90s and a slight shift to the left among liberals. So the three hypotheses we wanted to test again: our intergroup contact will reduce political polarization, backfire effects will increase political polarization, and conservatives will be more likely to exhibit backfire effects than liberals. And so to test this out, we put a survey in the field in October 2017. We surveyed about 800 Republicans and 800 Democrats about their political views. We gave them a battery of questions about their preferences for social policy issues around, for example, climate change, regulation of the economy, and so on. And then 1 week later, half of the Republicans and half of the Democrats were invited to follow a bot that they were told was going to retweet 24 messages a day. Importantly, they weren't told what the content of the bot's tweets would be. And for the first few days of the study, the bot was simply tweeting pictures of nature landscapes. And it gradually began to tweet 24 messages from political leaders of the opposing political party, as well as media organizations and nonprofit groups. I'll explain how we built the bots in just a second. So the respondents most of the respondents followed the bot for the entire month. And we gave them additional incentives to be able to answer questions about the content of the bot's tweets. And I'll give you an example of those in just a second. And that was so that we could monitor compliance with our treatment, whether or not people were paying attention and actually engaging with the bot. And then in November of 2017, we administered an identical survey. And we're trying to measure whether or not people's views on social policy issues become more conservative or more liberal based on their exposure to the bot. So importantly, this is a very restricted sample. We only looked at Twitter users living in the United States who visited Twitter 3 times a week. So this is a particularly active type of Twitter user. And also they had to identify as a Republican or a Democrat, so we didn't study independents. So if about 25% of the American population uses Twitter, probably about half of that is party ID'd and a frequent Twitter user. So the results of this study should not be generalized to the entire American public, but I think one can argue that this particular group of Twitter users has an outsized influence on the trajectory of public debate. So our outcome is derived from a very popular ideological consistency scale. It's been used in 16 previous studies over the last 20 years or so. Here you're seeing the overall sorting by Democrats and Republicans. This is data from the Pew Research Foundation. And so this scale that we use in our study is comprised of questions that I mentioned earlier, things like stricter, these are liberal-leaning or conservative-leaning statements, and people are asked to disagree or agree with them. So these are things like, poor people today have it easy because they can get government benefits without doing anything in return. Immigrants today strengthen our country because of their hard work and talents. And then an example of a conservative statement would be, government is always wasteful and inefficient. Okay. So I think the unusual part of our study was the bots. So let me take a few minutes to describe how we built them. First, we collected the names of every elected official and presidential candidate in the United States in mid-2017. And then we scraped the names of the people they follow. This resulted in a network of about 600,000 people. And from that graph, we eliminated anyone who wasn't followed by at least 15 elected officials or presidential candidates. And so the graph finally included not only the elected officials, but also media organizations such as Fox News or CNN, as well as advocacy groups, nonprofits, and other pundits or public political figures. Then with that much smaller graph, we run a correspondence analysis, and we take the first principal component to create a liberal conservative continuum. And then our bots randomly draw from that distribution, except for the middle quantile, and retweet any message that has been produced in the last 24 hours 24 times a day. And so users, we think, were exposed, or respondents in our study were exposed to a full range of messages from liberals and conservatives, depending on their political party. So we faced a difficult decision in the study, which was that the threat of people simply ignoring the bots. How could we know if they weren't paying attention? So we resorted to cute cats. Once a day, our bot retweeted a picture like one of these. And at the end of each week, we deleted all these tweets, and we surveyed the respondents to ask them whether or not they could identify the animal that we had been tweeting all week. And the goal here was to be able to see whether people we were getting impressions of the bot's tweets, whether people's eyeballs were passing over the bot's tweets. But we also wanted to know whether people were actually digesting and interpreting and closely reading the tweets. And so we asked a series of questions about the content of the bot's tweets that was not easily searchable. An example of those would be something like, over the past 3 days, the Twitter account named after the bot retweeted a message about a philanthropist who gave a large amount of money to help people recover from a major disaster. How much money did this person donate? And then, the person would have to answer $1,000 or $100,000 and so on. We used a block randomization design where we were able to control for people's pre-treatment strength of echo chamber. So we used our bot ideological measure to score each person's political bias in their own network, as well as their overall level of interest in the news or in politics. And finally, their frequency of Twitter usage and their strength of partisanship, whether they describe themselves as a strong Democrat or a weak Democrat. We also asked them questions about their exposure to people from the other party offline and online, as I mentioned. And then from our survey firm, which is one of the largest firms in the US, we also collected dozens of other demographics like age, gender, income, education, region, et cetera. So about 65% of the people who we invited to follow our bots followed the bots, and all of those people followed it for the entire month. About 41% answered all substantive questions about the content of the bot's tweets. Remember, we're incentivizing them to do that, which questions the external validity of the study, but allowed us to come up with a more sophisticated measure of estimating our treatment effects. And a smaller number could identify the cute animals. And I should say we did an analysis of attrition bias, whether or not being exposed to the bot led people to leave the study, and we didn't see any difference according to whether or not people were in treatment control in terms of whether they left the study. But we got a lot of angry messages to the bot, that's for sure. Okay. So the results. Okay. What I'm going to show you here is the effect of following a bot for 1 month. So I'll show you the results separately for Democrats and for Republicans because we ran separate experiments for both of those groups. And then I'm going to show you the treatment effect according to different levels of compliance. So first I'll show you the intent to treat effect, or the effect of being assigned to the treatment group. Then I'll show you the effect for people who followed the bot for the entire month. Then I'll show you people who could answer some of the questions, but not all of the questions, and then I'll show you people who could answer all of the questions. And on the graph I'm about to show you, a move to the left indicates a more liberal change in views as a result of being exposed to the bot, and a move to the right means more conservative views after following the bot. And so here's what we see. For Democrats, there's no significant change for following the bot, statistically significant, that is. With our most generous measure of compliance, people who were able to answer every single question, we see a very small effect, but again, it's not statistically significant. For Republicans, however, we see a sizable effect that increases steadily with the level of compliance. So the more people paid attention to the bot, the more conservative they became. So these findings provide no support for the theory of intergroup contact, but support for the backfire effect, but interestingly, perhaps only for conservatives, or perhaps there's a small liberal backfire effect as well. And this effect, though small, in the world of social science, most of our treatment effects are pretty small, could be compared to the overall shift in partisan divides over the last 10 years or so. So just through 1 month of outgroup exposure. So there's a number of important caveats with this research. I already mentioned that the results shouldn't be generalized to the entire public because these are only social media users on one platform at one point in time in one country, and at that, only a certain type of social media user, highly politically active, frequent social media user. And so we definitely need, I think, additional studies in other locations and with other populations and on other social media platforms. Second, we incentivize people to answer questions about the bot. And so this, as I mentioned earlier, kind of threatens the external validity of the findings. We don't know that if we release these bots into the wild, so to speak, whether or not they would have the same effect, or if the effect is only generated if people actually read the content of the bot's tweets. Lastly, we can't directly observe the mechanism of the backfire effect. We would like to know that it's some kind of inner cognitive process, such as motivated reasoning or counter-arguing. And we can see some evidence of increased negative sentiment among Republicans when they're replying to liberal opinion leaders. But we certainly can't throw everyone in an fMRI machine, which is what we'd really like to do, right? But I think there's some interesting results on offer here. To my knowledge, this is the first study to experimentally disrupt social media echo chambers on such a large scale and using a field experiment as opposed to a laboratory experiment, and especially over a protracted period of time, 1 month. It's the first study to show the effects of asymmetric polarization or backfire effects in that context. And I think the combination of survey research, network analysis, and bots provides an interesting model for future studies in the field that I've been, and so many other people here have been building, called computational social science. Lastly, I just want to say a thank you to my wonderful collaborators, most of whom are my students or postdocs. And if you'd like to see a copy of the paper, it's available at this link, and I'd love to hear comments from you via one of these other venues. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, if you had been able to do follow-up research and show that, in fact, it was motivated reasoning that was the cause of the backfire effect, how important is a social media platform for being able to generalize, given that, as you pointed out in the beginning, this is not interpersonal contact?
Sure.
These are users that are already in an echo chamber.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that was one question. The generalization outside of a non-face-to-face interaction. And the second is, this research was done in October and November 2017. There's been lots of political science and social science research that indicates that the Republican Party is not the same party that it was just 2 years ago. So do you feel comfortable calling this liberal-conservative distinction versus a Trump supporter versus a non-Trump supporter distinction?
Yeah, they're both really good questions. To the first point, we did have people with varied strength of social media echo chambers in our study, and we used different treatment blocks, and we observed the effects in different treatment blocks. So I don't think it's the effect. We're simply measuring the effect of people who are only in echo chambers. I mean, most everyone is in an echo chamber, as you probably wouldn't be surprised to know. I think though I certainly agree that interpersonal contact would be a more likely mechanism to reduce political polarization. We live in a world where about 95% of young people are on social media, and somewhere around 80 to 90% of them in the US get most or all of their news from social media. And so the idea that we can, somehow simply go offline, I think is like a lost cause. So I think, though I agree that, that's not to say we shouldn't do offline interventions, but I think we have to take seriously the consequences of how deeply embedded we are within social media. And then to the second point about the liberal conservative continuum, I certainly think you're right. We could even do the same thought experiment with the left in terms of the Bernie Sanders supporters versus the Hillary Clinton supporters. I think one way our study speaks to this is we use a difference in difference design. So we're measuring change after the realignment of the Republican Party would have occurred in 2017. And so we're conditional on those opinions already being changed. We're then measuring the effect of the exposure. But I do think a really interesting follow-up study, which we're considering now, would be to look at the effect of exposure to moderates versus extremists. The idea being that there might be some kind of curvilinear effect where exposure to moderates might produce moderation, but exposure to extremists might produce backfire effects or something like that. All right, thanks.